Issandr El Amrani is a very accomplished political analyst who has joined us all the way from Morocco to be with us. He is the founder of the Arabist, which is one of the most read blogs on Arab politics and culture. His work has been featured in numerous publications, including The Economist, Financial Times, and The National. While being a successful writer, he is also the director for North Africa at the International Crises Group. Issandr, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
So what is the current situation in Libya? Who are the actors and what is at stake?
Libya is an incredibly complicated situation because there's not just two sides fighting each other, although sometimes it's presented as that because the country has currently two rival governments, one in the east, one in the west. It's actually incredibly fragmented, and you have almost, I like to describe it as an archipelago. It's a series of islands, each island around the city or around a certain part of the country, controlled by a different militia. And that's been the situation since 2014, especially when there was, in June, an election that was immediately contested, and part of the new parliament that was elected went to the east and set up a government there, and the previous parliament stayed in Tripoli. And since then, the situation has evolved. The UN got involved. In 2015, there was an agreement signed called the Libyan Political Agreement that tries to resolve the crisis. It didn't really take. And now you have a new effort by the UN with a new special envoy of the United Nations, Secretary General. His name is Hassan Salame, a Lebanese politician, who is trying to, again, kind of reset the peace process and put in place a way to unite the two governments, unite the rival parliaments, and bring some level of stability to the country. Now, in the meantime, it's a bit like herding cats. It's really, there's so many groups, Libya is an Arab country, but it has Berber and Tabu, which are an ethnic group from the south of Libya, a bit like you find Tabus also in northern Chad and other parts of Africa. Tuareg, who are historically nomadic group from across the Sahel region, also in the south. You have all these different interests, and of course a country whose 97% of its wealth comes from oil and gas. So all of these people are essentially fundamentally, even if they have local grievances, even if they have ideological differences, what they're really fighting over eventually is control of that wealth.
So why is petroleum such an important resource in Libya?
Well, Libya has been producing oil since at least the 1950s, and when the industry really established itself there, it completely changed the country. It was a mostly desert, quite poor, mostly Bedouin, nomadic, pastoralist country until then. And suddenly they had huge amounts of wealth. It transformed the country. Of course, part of that transformation brought out a lot of political tensions. In the late 60s, Muammar Gaddafi took over in a military coup, remained in power for 42 years. And in 2011, as part of the Arab Spring, there was a rebellion against him that eventually led to his overthrow. So the question of oil has always been central because Libyans basically feel that under Gaddafi, he was taking all the benefits of the oil wealth, him and a few people around him, essentially, and it wasn't redistributing to the rest of the population. And so there's this expectation that's been created that after Gaddafi, the oil money would be more fairly spread in different parts of the country to different constituencies. And that really hasn't happened. I mean, partly because it's difficult to change the way the country was run, partly because the state was very weakened, so you don't have strong central control in Libya in the 2011 war, and partly because there's been a trend of local groups that feel that they're not getting their fair share of the pie, blocking pipelines, blocking oil wells, blocking oil trading facilities around the country. So whereas Libya produced 1.8 million barrels of oil, and it's very high quality oil, it's what's called in the oil industry a light and sweet crude. It's very free of elements essentially that lessen the quality of the oil. So this is very much prized and sought after type of oil that's used to make like kerosene for and jet fuel, things like that. And so they used to produce 1.8 million barrels of oil per day. That a few years ago fell down to 250,000. because of all the oil stoppages. Now, they've worked to re-up the production, and they're close to 1 million now, but still far from 1.8 million that they used to produce. In the meantime, that's created something of an economic crisis because the country really doesn't make money anywhere else. It doesn't export anything else. It doesn't manufacture things. And people are used to a certain standard of living. And then that, plus the war, plus the pillaging of state resources and so on that takes place, has really made life a lot harder for ordinary Libyans who are not rich, especially with the state no longer doing all the spending they used to be doing, with at the same time international oil prices being very low. Libya is facing an economic crisis, so it has to up its production, it has to rationalize its spending, and it has to find some kind of political agreement about how it's going to spend. And all of this is extremely difficult to do when you don't have a central authority that's strong, and when you have all these competing groups plus regional and international interests at odds with one another that are destabilizing the country.
So then the central government is in control of petroleum right now, correct?
Well, it's in control in the sense of, there's being in control on the ground of where the oil fields, of the pipelines, of the facilities, the refineries, the export terminals on the sea. It's kind of in control of those, but like I said, subject to sometimes a local militia will kind of attack and shut it down and say, you need to pay us, otherwise we won't let you reopen this. But there's a more important type of control that has, so far really helped to keep Libya as stable as you can, which is that the UN has issued a resolution back in 2014 forbidding anyone from selling Libyan oil except the national oil company. And that means that, so you can't have a free-for-all. It's very, very difficult for oil traders unless there is sanctions. In 2015, there was the U.S. Navy SEALs actually intercepted a ship that was carrying crude oil out of a port in central Libya. It's very difficult for people to trade that oil out if it's not with the approval of the internationally recognized government and its oil corporation, and then the payment gets made to the central bank. So that system has been preserved. That's been hugely important to preserve the economic stability of Libya as far as you can in a chaotic situation. These institutions, their role continue to be respected, even if they have to deal with threats by various armed groups that are trying to get their basically payoffs from the government.
So if a foreign actor, hypothetically speaking, were to invade and take control of Libya, what do you think would happen to the petroleum?
Well, I think first, a foreign actor who would be facing an absolutely impossible situation in Libya. It's a huge country that's mostly desert, sparsely populated. It's kind of hard to control. It's hard to be able to control its borders and so on. Secondly, on the petroleum, I think the question is not so much someone from outside coming in and taking control of it, because what would likely happen would be that it would be impossible to trade like petroleum. Now, there is some illegal trade that takes place. For instance, some of the crude oil gets basically converted in kind of homemade refineries into kind of very low-grade fuel that's used in diesel trucks and so on that can handle it, and goes to sub-Saharan Africa. But mostly, if you're going to process crude oil into usable fuel, into fuel for power stations, let's say, or things like that, you need facilities, you need technical know-how. It's difficult to do by yourself. And so the international community is quite adept at putting in place at least legal provisions to prevent any oil that's illegally seized from being at least used outside the country. Now, there's a whole range of complicated things that can be done with refined fuels, as in that Libya is a huge source for all the neighboring countries of contraband fuel, because it's subsidized in Libya, so it's incredibly cheap, and it's sold. So neighboring countries, it's smuggled to neighboring countries, and sold at the markup there. So there's corruption and contraband around those things. But generally speaking, you couldn't just seize, the oil fields and do what you want with the oil, even if you had the military power.
So, because of the poor living standards that the population is encountering in Libya, there has been an influx of, refugee crisis, especially in Europe. How is Europe dealing with all of these Libyans who are trying to flee the country?
Yeah, well, actually, they're mostly not Libyans. They're mostly sub-Saharan Africans and people from other places who pass through Libya because it's close to the Italian coast to reach Europe. So this crisis, which has been going on since 2015 and has really only increased, I think last year in 2017, there were about maybe 170,000 migrants who tried to cross the Mediterranean, is a humanitarian tragedy, first and foremost, because all these people coming into Libya, usually from the south, are incredibly vulnerable to the people who smuggle them, the people smugglers who take them across Libya. There's been instances of people essentially being forced to do kind of slave labor. There's all kinds of human rights abuses. They're often, including men, women, small children being kept in absolutely just horrible situation and being exploited because they have to pay their way. They have to pay the people smugglers who take them to the coast and then put them onto boats where then again they risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean. So there's the European Union has deployed along with a number of international NGOs these rescue missions. But it's a huge political problem for Europe because on the one hand, of course, they have a duty and they are helping those people and rescuing them at sea. But it's unpopular at home to have such a huge influx of an uncontrolled influx of migrants, and it's having an impact on European politics, and you're seeing the rise of kind of very strongly anti-immigration right-wing parties in places like Germany, in places like the Netherlands and France. In some places, it's like in Italy recently, some of these parties have done well enough to get into government. In others, they haven't. But Europe is having a tough time deal with this and is looking at Libya as the source of, a lot of these problems. Because as long as Libya is chaotic and as long as there's no government in place there that can collaborate, the flow will continue. It's just because it's geography. It's easy. It's only a few hundred, less than 100, few dozen miles from parts of western Libya to basically some Italian islands or the tip of Sicily. It's a tremendously difficult thing to deal with because there's all these political considerations. There's various things that have been tried. Some have been, I think, counterproductive. There's been basically attempts to pay off some of the militias involved in migrant smuggling, which just encourages them to do it more, basically. There's been training of the Libyan Coast Guard and trying to keep people from crossing, which in theory, helps save lives. But remember, if you're preventing them from leaving Libya and they're stuck in Libya, they're facing an incredibly hostile environment and abuse and so on in Libya. So that there's a human rights and humanitarian issue that you have to contend with. There's been some attempts now by the Europeans and some sub-Saharan African countries like Nigeria, where a lot of these migrants come from, to take back those people, so have flights back from Libya. But, to be honest, the long-term trend is that the disparity between the quality of life that people have in sub-Saharan Africa and the quality of life that they might have in Europe for themselves, for their children, is so huge that there's a huge pull factor. There's a huge pull factor, and it's not only we've seen that not only from Libya, we saw it in Turkey. A lot of migrants from Syria coming through Turkey before. We're seeing it in my country, in Morocco, which is very close to Spain. There's been an uptick recently as it's become more difficult in Libya. Some people are going through Morocco. It's a hard issue to resolve.
For sure. How do you think, in your opinion, the international community can help stop the sub-Saharan Africans from just migrating? Do you think the international community should be more involved or less involved?
Well, they're definitely to be more involved because this is a humanitarian issue on a large scale. Libya is currently not able to deal with it. It has barely any functioning government. But resolving the conflict in Libya and improving the quality of the government and its ability to control things, to control borders, to police, to prevent militias from carrying, exploiting these migrants that are coming through. You need a peace process in place that leads to some kind of political solution that brings stability, and not only stability actually for in terms of improving security and so on, but also economic stability, so that Libya can start selling more oil and gas, and can start spending again, something it hasn't done since 2014, on infrastructure, on rebuilding the country. And that in itself has the potential to actually absorb a huge amount of the migrant workers who are now going to Europe. Because traditionally, that's what Libya has done. Libya is a huge country with a native population of only 6 million. It's always had about 3 million foreign guest workers in the country, in the construction sector, and service industry, and various parts of the economy. It's been able to absorb that, and Libyans, they're used to that. So I think if you're able to at least stabilize the country to the extent that its economy gets up again, back on its feet, that it's able to invest in some of the projects that have been suspended, whether it might be highways, railroads, construction projects, housing, healthcare sector. Most of the healthcare in Libya was provided by foreigners. The nurses and doctors were mostly foreign. It has the capacity to absorb at least some of that flow. And then I think there's little alternative to really crack down on the people who are the people smugglers, and frankly, at this point, it's a complex international criminal network with different parts of the journey that people have. There's different groups involved, but once they get to Europe, it's even the mafia, for instance, in Italy involved. And that's policing work, and you need to kind of crack down on that. And I think there's a little alternative also. I mean, from a humane point of view, from addressing which I think the European Union is doing a fine job on now, which is rescuing the people who are stranded at sea, preventing them, of course, also from getting on those boats, which are death traps, often, just overpacked boats that are sent, basically, the smugglers, the people smugglers, send them out just towards Italy. They know that the boats aren't going to make it, and they're just banking on that people are going to rescue them. So and you just have to, if you're a decent human being, what are you going to do? You're going to have to rescue them.
So on a different note, there has been news of ISIS regrouping now. So what are your thoughts on that? What's going on with ISIS?
Yeah, so basically, because of the chaos that has existed in Libya since 2014 especially, ISIS was able to kind of make its first major kind of beachhead outside of Iraq and Syria, where it started back in 2013. Libya is the first country outside of that where they've managed to actually gain territorial control. And they took control of a city in the center of Libya on the coast called Sirte, which is Gaddafi's old birthplace. So it was a city that very much was a loser out of the 2011 rebellion. And it was kind of punished for it, abandoned, and some of the locals basically not seeing themselves as on the outs with the new authorities, joined ISIS, or at least tolerated ISIS coming into the city. ISIS imposed the complete draconian control that it has done elsewhere. And it took a couple of years for Libyans, together with the international community, and especially the US, which carried out a lot of airstrikes on Sirte, for basically a coalition of Libyans to get ISIS out. You have to remember that Libya is a kind of low-tech war. It's a war that's fought in the desert on pickup trucks that are mounted with light artillery guns, and then people with machine guns and so on. There's no high tech. There's no Patriot missiles. There's no air defense systems. There's a few old Soviet planes that are used by one side of Soviet era planes. That are used by one side. So mostly it's a war where you have people moving rapidly across the desert on pickup trucks, and it's not very large numbers of men. And the difficulty with that is that it's quite easy to go and hide, because you can blend in, and you can go hide in the desert, you can blend in the local population, because everyone's driving those pickup trucks. And And because there's so many militias around there, everyone has guns also. So it's when ISIS was kicked out of Sirte, it kind of went slightly to the south and kind of blended in, where it found tribal alliances, often people and tribes who were, again, on the losing side in 2011, who were closer to Gaddafi and now have lost their kind of status and privileges. And since then, they've been carrying out hit-and-run attacks, a few suicide bombings and so on their enemies in Libya. And there's two main camps in Libya, and they're attacking both sides. And they're just trying to basically make the situation more chaotic. Because, what we've learned really over the last 5 years of dealing with ISIS is that ISIS thrives on chaos. It thrives on disorder. The more hatred there is in a place between different groups, the more fighting there is between, let's say, rebels and a government and who are not jihadists, the more it will have opportunities to get back on its feet, the more it will have opportunities to acquire weapons, to recruit men, to impose itself on a local level and then grow. This is the lesson from Syria, it's the lesson from Iraq, and it's the lesson from Libya. And of course, this is another reason why finding a solution to the Libyan conflict, some people might be tempted to say, well, they're not harming anyone, they're just doing it to each other, it's not, who cares, let's move on. But Libya is a couple of 100 kilometers from the coast of Europe, It's pretty close by. It's the stability of all the neighboring countries, Tunisia, Algeria, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Egypt, that has an impact on. So, right now, the Libyans aren't, because sometimes they're more concerned about fighting, the mainstream factions are more concerned about fighting each other than fighting ISIS. Sometimes they're not very efficient. But there's enough, they have enough worry themselves, plus they are being supported in this, especially by the US, which regularly carries out airstrikes at targets it identifies as being either ISIS or Al-Qaeda, has managed to keep them at bay for now.
Perfect. Issandr, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.